Okay, we're back for a really interesting session, and this one I hope will take us into our body minds in a way that kind of expands on many of the other kinds of discussions that we've had this morning and pick up on lots of different threads. But before we get going, I'm going to take my shoes off, and I've got hungry feet. They just want to kind of loosen up and touch the ground. So I'd invite you to feel like you can take your shoes off if that's comfortable for you, and if not, anything else, just to kind of notice your feet on the ground. I feel like, even in these kinds of contexts, it's very easy to get very cerebral, very stuck in our heads in the world of ideas and words, and we've got these living bodies that are constantly percolating and processing, but we tend to second them into the background. And yet they're so rich with information, intelligence, and they can guide us really quite profoundly. So I am here today with Inês. Now let me see if I can say your surname properly. I probably should have asked you before, but is it Hipólito?
Hipólito, yeah.
Hipólito.
Yeah.
And where's that surname from?
It's Greek.
It's Greek.
Yeah.
Okay, Hipólito. So yeah, and you're from Macquarie University, and Inês is a neuroscientist and a philosopher of artificial intelligence. She works across technology, the idea of cognition, and very much an expanded notion of what we might understand to be cognition, our relationships with agency, with the environment. We're going to really stretch into this through this conversation today. And let's see where we go. So over to you, Inês, and just to kind of maybe you can expand a little bit more on where you come from, and particularly what you do, and this notion of what it means to talk about this word cognition, or the idea of thinking.
Yeah, so my background is a little bit interdisciplinary, from neuroscience and philosophy of mind and AI. So I tend to situate that within complex systems theory and dynamical systems as a modeling technique, to model different kinds of things. As I tend to ask, is there anything around us that is not a complex system? Right? I tend to ask the questions this other way around. I do a lot of conceptual engineering in the middle of trying to think and map things in a complex system kind of way. So I tend to apply that to many different things, from mental health. I've got work on applying complex systems to mental health conditions, but all the way to modeling artificial intelligence systems as ecosystems of intelligence, rather than a kind of like a more computational kind of approach that we have still a bit nowadays. And then, of course, all the way to the ways in which we think cognition as being very much, I tend to talk about it as a place cognition, so in situ cognition. And my background, I navigate in these waters, and my background being interdisciplinary, I suppose that it helps me because it gives me many different tools, because I tend to think about this way of working and thinking as what I call a bricolage, because you bring many different things from many places. So that's kind of like where I'm at. I'm at the university, Macquarie University, and before this I was at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain in Humboldt, Berlin. And I've also been associated with a company that develops AI as ecosystems of intelligence, and Carl Friston's, which I'm not sure if you've heard of his work in neuroscience. He's known as the most cited neuroscientist in the world, and his theory is the free energy principle, which is a principle of the brain. And we developed that in this company in Los Angeles. So that's my kind of like touch with the more corporate and industry out of academia. So that's kind of like situating me, I hope, at least theoretically.
We've got lots that we could go on with there, and but I think I kind of want to jump in there. You just talked about this sort of theory of the brain, and I want to kind of step into this idea of what do we think thinking is, and where do we think thinking happens? Does it only happen in the brain, or is there, from where I've sort of come from, we're really shifting into this much more distributed notion of the idea of what thinking is and what cognition is. I mean, obviously the brain has a very specific kind of place and space in that process, but maybe you can kind of expand on that and then I can riff with you.
I love that. That's one of my favorite topics as a embodied cognitive scientist, and trading within the enactivist approach, which is a very much placing cognition back to the situation itself. One of the main theories that we've had for the longest time, ever since the Turing machine, right? We've been very fond of thinking of cognition and intelligence and the ways in which we have our practices and we do our things in terms of a computer, very much inspired from the Turing machine at the time. So a lot of what we have thought and conceived, at least theoretically or frameworks-wise, academically at least, and of course maybe very less so in more embodied practices, but at least academically within cognitive science, it is been very much permeated by the mind-machine metaphor. Right, so thinking of the ways in which humans think as if they were computers. And that in itself already has so many implications for the society, because if we think about the ways in which one would formalize intelligence or cognition or embodied experience in terms of inputs and outputs, then that is going to spread out into mental health models, education models, creative models, right? And it's kind of like narrowing the scope of, instead of like opening the ways in which, I like that somebody had a quote before us, and the quote was the ways in which, the ways in which we don't think together, or we don't think the same thing.
Great minds don't always think alike.
Exactly. Yeah. I love that so much, because that's precisely the case, right? Because there's a standardization. Once we think about inputs and outputs, then we are already doing a standardization. And there's no scope to have conversations that I think would be much richer while we're not taking this internal machine input-output reductionist perspective.
So for me, I think I had these questions around what it is to be human, what is it that we value, and how do we understand ourselves? And I've come at that question from lots of different theoretical spaces, including psychology. And I studied neuroscience at university. I studied abnormal psychology. I studied social psychology. I actually love social psychology. I love neuroscience as well. But they all felt like they were sort of looking at being human, because they were actually using a lot of laboratory studies with rats and all kinds of other creatures to make inferences of what it was that formed thinking and processing. But at the same time, I ended up studying ecology, and this notion of a living organic system kept sort of percolating in my mind, and no one of those lenses was kind of giving me what felt like thinking was. And behind that probably was these social and cultural questions of what do we value and what do we not value. And there was sort of two probably key sources of friction that I was probably metabolizing at the time, which was I loved the arts, I loved making, I loved moving, and it felt like what was valued was stuff that was very sort of sedentary and had a very kind of specific hierarchy around how to think and what was valuable in thinking. So you could kind of go the maths and science, or certain kinds of subjects, if you like, were considered valuable. And I felt like there's something happening when I make art, or there's something happening when we move through the world that is not being valued and captured here. And then, part of that also sort of went back to my childhood in Africa in particular, where as a child, you look at the world with very sort of open eyes. And I'd go to the marketplaces where I lived, and there's this rich community where people were making things, and it was intergenerational, and it was this model of kind of like how to live was very different. So I didn't question it, it just was. And then when I came back to Australia, I kind of realised, okay, there's other ways of living. And it just felt like the older I got and the more I kind of travelled through the education system and then kind of looked at the career and employment system, it looked like there's this real hierarchy of what's valued. So when I was studying psychology, I was also asking, what are we not looking at? Or I was looking for something that was missing. And then slowly but surely I got to the biopsychosocial approach to understanding what cognition. And eventually, a lot of this stuff wasn't even around when I was originally studying, the idea of the extended mind. And that has been something that has been very strong and resonant for me ever since. So this idea that, yes, we have this high kind of, we want to use these machine metaphors for how we live, but that our mind is actually distributed through our whole system, and it's constantly interacting with the world. And that is constantly being shaped by the world around us as well, including our cultural and social backgrounds. So we had a little bit of a conversation about that. But I mean, I wondered if you, in your research or your work around cognition, whether you have kind of, stepped into that notion of the extended mind and what we kind of mean when we're talking about embodied cognition.
Yeah, no, that is very much present. And I do think that the concept of extended mind came in 98 by Chalmers and Clark. And I think it did a great deal for breaking a little bit this sedimented concept of mind being internal to the brain at work, right, with inputs and outputs. So it did a great deal at the time. At least to unlock the possibility that perhaps it is actually extended through the tools that we engage with, which is the focus that the extended mind comes across, or at least it's the focus of the extended mind. And then we have these other approaches like embodied cognition and activism that bring in other focus to that conversation. But relating to you a little bit, when I was doing my master's back in Lisbon, I remember that I was struggling so much with research, as in what my thesis is going to be at, because at the time, this was a few years back, and at the time we had way less technology that was more dynamic, that we could use for subjects to actually move in the environment. And I found my classes back then and all of the paradigms and the tools that I had that were available to us to do research on social cognition extremely reductive. And I was like, but how am I going to study how people interact and the subjectivity between people with like someone looking at a screen and button pushing? I'm like, that's not, that's, you just create, it's so artificial. And then in the end, am I really studying interaction? Or what is this that I'm studying, right? Because people look at the pictures and faces and then they're going to go in. I'm like, that's not it. I was so frustrated, right? So what am I going to do? I was like, I wish that we would have some technology that we could at least have some EEG as people at least interact with each other, and we can have some brain synchronization and those kinds of things, which at the time they were not so much available. So I was so frustrated with when I did this was my cognitive science master's. There were so many different fields available to me because it was cognitive science. So I was doing from psycholinguistics to psychology to neuroscience, and I was like so frustrated with all of them. I suppose that now things are a little bit better, and eventually when I did find the complex systems approach to these things, I was like, thank God, because otherwise I would know how I would do it, because I really like to study the mind and interactions mostly, but the tools that we had were very rudimentary. So this is relating a little bit. Andy Clark, who used to have to be appointed as well to Macquarie University, we're very proud of that. He has done tremendous work and is really, really, really good and incredibly talented. And his work is quite unparalleled for within recent years to cognitive science and to thinking about the mind and bringing it, or at least pulling it out of, conceptually, pulling it out of the brain and considering the ways in which cognition is situated in this particular case with the extended mind, how these things are going to be an extension of our thinking. But I like to push a little bit back on the extended mind and give Clark a little bit of trouble. And the idea being that there may be no difference between, this being a technological device, or that one being a technology device, right? Because it's ways in which the idea being that they focused so much on it being a technological device. And what I like to think about is how we think with our fingers. Right, so these are the kinds of classes I'm lecturing this semester on art and cognition and politics, and that's the kind of dilemmas or puzzles that I like to put to the students. Is like when you are painting something, right? Where is your thinking? Is your thinking in the head? And the other day, the puzzle that I put to the students was Van Gogh, because he's never sold any painting in his life, right? I think he sold one. I think he sold one. And then I asked the students, was Van Gogh already creative in life since he didn't sell any painting? Was it afterwards when he was recognized and now he's got a museum? Or was it the practice? Right? And then we worked out all of these different possibilities of, okay, it's in the head, therefore, it's internal to it, therefore, it was already creative all along. Or was it in the recognition? Only afterwards, and dependent on the condition that it would have been recognized, could he have become a creative, or whatever his doings were creative, right? Or was it in the practice all along? In which case, is the ways in which he thought with his fingers. He thought with, as we usually say in embodied cognitive science, that your thinking is in the brush itself, right? That's where you are. That's where so that's the trouble that I like to give Andy, is that it doesn't have to be technological. My thinking might be in the brush itself.
So one of the other authors that sort of influenced me, I think Guy Claxton, he sort of, in a way, kind of congealed or brought together a whole lot of research that looks at the sort of the notion of embodied cognition. And that kind of goes into beyond this notion of sort of interaction with technology, but also how we engage our full mind and our full body in relationship with the material and the living world. So a paintbrush has bristles. It has a stem that's wood that has a weight and a proportion. It's in our hands. And our hands are moving in a particular way, and these have memories, and they transmit information. And then you pick up the paintbrush, and one of my favorite things at the moment is to paint with watercolor inks. I just love it. I just love watching ink move in water. Yeah. It's like looking at a living kind of molecular process, and that transmits that water, that ink. Even the kind of paintbrush it is, transmits a sensation that I can feel inside of me, and it's not up here necessarily. Or I can feel it in different parts of my brain. Like I can literally feel, if I'm have been doing too much analytical, prefrontal thinking, my front lobe gets hot. So you can kind of tune into these sensations and these interactions, and so for me, because I have an arts practice, the material world is really important. And then the material world becomes a conduit to the living world, because materials come from somewhere and they've been shaped or transformed, and then they constantly are being shaped and transformed. So and we think, when we talk about practice-led research, which we were talking about earlier, this is the practice and the materials and your engagement with them, and I'm really big into the hands, by the way, thinking and doing with the hands. Our hands have an incredible sort of representation in terms of, you know, being represented in multiple areas of our brain. But, you know, how we move our hand, even the direction, you know, and I've thought a lot about the difference between typing versus, and there's research just now looking at the difference between typing and cursive writing. So these they're just down to the movement, but then they're also embedded in the social context. So that when I think of the extended mind or the expanded mind, I'm thinking about these many, many different kinds of ways that we can interact and modulate and sense into the world around us.
Yeah, absolutely. One way that I really like to think about that is the ways in which the world creates resistance. Right. So then, if you're working with your hands and in whatever kind of creative craft, in my case, is very, very much just for fun. But what seems to be happening is the ways in which the world is giving us trouble, is creating resistances. So if I grab a brush to try to paint something, I'm not an artist by any means, but if you try to create something, the process by which it's going to be so interactive such that it will, at least in my non-artistic, very non-artistic way, you cannot predict what is going to be the outcome. Right, so because it takes that experiential resistance between you and what is happening. It's not even a between you and what is happening. It's that moment in itself. And here I'm not doing entirely justice because it's really hard to capture that in the language that is available to us. But there's a concept that is useful there, I think, which is the concept of affordances from ecological psychology. And that does a great deal for us in that particularly expanding Simone de Beauvoir's ways of explaining the in situ, the navigation of the environment, in terms of a continuous negotiation between agency and facticity, right? Between freedom and facticity. So there's these resistances, right, that we may find in many different practices and things that we do. It could be that we are painting and we can think about it like that. There are things that are afforded and others that are less afforded. So I'm thinking the ways in which that experiential, very phenomenological, kind of like experiential interaction or practice itself can be thought of as this kind of like negotiation, very not intellectual here, but this kind of like negotiation of an affordance field almost, right? Something that, this is a big jump that I'm going to do now, something that we may even be able to think about that in terms of, there's a lecture that Einstein gave in Berlin, which was experiential geometry. And I love to think about that, or to use that concept for the ways not only that we navigate the world as this experiential geometry, like almost a vectorial kind of thing of affordances. Some are possible. Some affordances are already possible and there. Others you need to forge. And Simone de Beauvoir comes in and says, well, you need to negotiate them and go against a little bit against that resistance. So I kind of like I'm trying to get a kind of like a lexicon that allows us to think this much more embodied, interactive, online place cognition. Because language is not useful here. It has been conceptualized for many, many, many years for us to speak things in such ways that are inputs or outputs, at least that's the kind of like lexicon that I mostly get within my field, that I think doesn't do that kind of like justice, all the way from whether we are holding a brush or whether we are trying to, question certain particular affordances within the social space, for example. Yeah.
So some of the themes that I'm picking up on there, which is sort of woven into our conversation, is that we're sort of challenging some of the kind of tropes of what thinking is, in terms of thinking being something that's individual, something that's internal, and something that's abstract. So if I kind of think back to this notion of affordance. When you were talking, what came up in my mind is not only affordance but action and repetition, and this notion of friction. And you know, there's been a period in design where it was all about frictionless design, and I was always like, why is that so good? You know, like, you know, what they want us to spend our money without thinking about it, like, you know, and how is it even good for us as beings? You know, and friction is not, you know, it's got a bad name, but why? You know, it's how we learn. And I always think, for whatever reason, I built a house in my 20s, an earth house, and I did it. It was totally physical, very few machines. And I basically, it was my classroom during the day. And at night I went and did a master's. And, you know, so my whole body was immersed in the environment, you know. And so I learnt things about the living environment around me, the birds, the soil, I learnt to smell fire smoke before it almost like hadn't even started. You could pick the conditions, you know, the air, the sort of dryness of the air and the wind, and you could think a fire's going to come. The soil, like, there's so many things that I learnt. But I also had to learn to use tools. And I remember finally I got to the point of like having a roof over, you know, put the roof on, and we were getting to the floor. And I hadn't really, you know, nailing wasn't a craft I'd learned. And I remember this one day thinking, oh, we're going to get the floor down, great, you know, close to getting to move in. And I had to nail the floorboards in, and I pretty much spent a whole day bending the nails. I was really bad at hammering, and it was so frustrating. But what I learned was this relationship between the weight of the hammer, the length of the hammer, and my body and my muscles, and this kind of, it was a whole body kinesthetic, spatial, multiple, you know, knowing the nail, even the kind of what do you call it, like the resistance in the nail, the hardness, the thickness. There was so many things at stake. And it took me a whole day. And by the end of the day, I was there, like, ding, and it would go in. You know, less bends. But what happened, you know, that was a real friction experience. Yep. And it wasn't something that I could solve in an abstract way. It wasn't something that I could even solve by kind of thinking in a particular way. I had to involve my body. And it's, you know, to me, it's like an example of a complex algorithm. If, you know, we are using machine metaphors, but I do like to go back to the idea that, you know, we draw these ideas and these concepts from the living world, not from us. So this idea that machines come first is a kind of misnomer. So if we're talking about algorithms, this living thing that is connecting my muscles, my mind, my organisms, you know, and it's stayed in my system, that's pretty amazing. And it's not just one isolated thing that's happening, it's multiple. But that friction experience has infused this in my system. And, you know, I can pick up a hammer today. I might bang, you know, one or two bent nails, but that is in my body. And, you know, and we can talk about countless experiences like that, riding bikes, all kinds of stuff. So that kind of takes this idea of being, you know, this abstract thinking into this idea of thinking, this 4E cognition notion. Do you want to kind of unpack that a little bit, you know?
Yeah, I would love that. So embodied cognition comes from phenomenology, a little bit like more back in the day. But my favorite, if I would go back and just to read what I think was the one that really connected it for me back to when I was doing my master's and super frustrated. It's like, oh, how are we going to do this? It's this chapter in Merleau-Ponty's book, Phenomenology of Perception. It's about the body, right? And that one was, for me, was like, thank God, finally. Which I think there's a couple of examples, and it's extremely good. But the one that I find useful, at least intuitive, to put the ways in which I think that you were referring to, of this embodied experience, it's like almost the notion of embodiment. One would ask, when is it that cognition is not embodied, right? So just try to find an example. When is cognition not embodied, right? So if we start there, then that is already kind of like a given. And then we can try to make some progress in thinking about, okay, so what is cognition, given that it's already embodied and it's never not, unless we need an example. So then the other part that I find really interesting and intuitive is the ways in which Merleau-Ponty explains that the body is transparent until it finds resistance. And what that means is it doesn't really use this particular resistance, but I think that it works really nicely here. It's like, let's say that you break an arm, right? All of a sudden, we're going to look at our arm like, what is going on, right? And it's going to become an object of inspection. You're going to be like inspecting it, like now, like either a detective or like a doctor. You're going to be inspecting what's going on. And at this moment, when you broke your arm, is when your arm becomes an object, right? It becomes something of inspection that is not transparent anymore. Otherwise, all things going pretty well, we walk around with our bodies and we navigate all of these environments in a very embodied way, such that embodying means that it's transparent, right? We're not looking at it as if we're an object of study, right? Not as a scientist, not as an engineer, not as a detective. And that's what embodiment means. It means that it's already always that, from there, and never not. Right? So even if the fact that we have to, in contemporary philosophy of mind or cognitive science, that we have to name it embodied cognition. It's almost like, when was it not embodied? Right? So it's almost what it is doing is it's doing a correction. Right? It's only there because before we had them more machine-like. So it's doing a correction. But once we think about what does this all mean, what work do words do, in the ways in which we theorize, very much theorize these things, it's quite interesting to see what they are doing. This one is correcting. But the embodiment, meaning, I think that's what I find really intuitive. It means this transparency in the ways in which I am already, from that perspective, a position, right? A position in some kind of like geometric space. I quite like that, which by that I mean not only a geometrical physical space, but also considering the kind of experiences that are already my autobiography. Right, so it's the kind of like the positionality in which, because if we think about the practice of a specialization, like for example art, being an artist that is very specialized, or a pianist that is very, very specialized, right? So the positionality in which the present is, it's relative to the autobiography, so to the practice itself. So I suppose that would be a little bit of the ways in which I like to think what embodied cognition means. It's something that is already there and never not it, right? It's not like we can just go and like, knock, knock, I would like to get out of like this embodiment right now, please, and I'll come back in 5, right? We can't do that. So it's almost like, why are we even talking about embodied? What would it be, right? So that's the
yeah,
point.
so that I actually love that, because I that's one of my, especially coming from a phenomenological background and a lean, it's we talk about the body and we talk about embodied cognition as really kind of like a way of, in my view, bringing attention to our senses and the rest of our body, and taking us out of these kind of abstract modes of being which are embodied. So it's got the word body in it, so you're kind of extending people's imaginations when you use the word. But the kind of practical phenomenological reality is we are sitting and using our minds in a particular kind of ways where we're collectively enacting the world, and that is embodied all the time. So when we talk, one of my big kind of gripes is the world is designed for us to go and sit at a desk and move our fingers like this and look at a screen and shorten our vision, and it's this, you walk in and everybody does it and you kind of feel like somehow you're kind of doing the wrong thing by not wanting to do that, because I physiologically don't want to occupy an environment like that with fluorescent lights and no birds around me, and it feels like a kind of environmental straitjacket to me. But I can't not do that because it's socially ordained, and not even, the piece that's difficult for me is that it's not questioned as much, and it seems like it's a default. So this goes back to this idea of affordances and the social context, and all of those things have embodied signatures. And you know, I might be one particular way, and I, for some sort of reason, seem to be more reactive. But you know, when I say that, it's like I might have that reaction, but other people may not. But the point is around sort of questioning what these things are doing to us, and coming back to this notion that there is an embodied signature happening all the time, and we are enacting those things whether we're conscious of it or not. So that's where the friction piece comes in. And I want to bring up this notion of autopoiesis. I don't know, have you come, you know, across that? So the idea that not only do we need friction to know ourselves and experience ourselves, but also that to know anything requires distinction, requires contrast. And, you know, so I can't hear high and low. I can't hear front and back. I can't feel things in that geospatial sense without having a sense of something in front of me, behind me. I can't even perceive colour without there being all these contrasts that afford me to see distinctions between different parts of the colour spectrum. And then I've got to have this biophysical process that affords me to process those things. So the notion of distinction is also something that really interests me, and I wondered if you kind of, how you think about that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Autopoiesis, from that's at least how it's been formulated, I think, in one of the best books of its kind by Varela and Maturana, from Cell to Cognition, the book. The notion of autopoiesis is self-organizing, that from cell to cognition continuum of self-organization, which is beautiful because it allows us to then do all of that all the way from neurobiology and all the way to social systems, and bring in like kind of like the Simone de Beauvoir, at least, perspective that I brought up earlier, this continuum of self-organizing and never really not, right? It's you are already reconfigured right now. Already reconfigured, right? This autobiography that is not a thing that you carry as a backpack, right? You already reconfiguring in relation, right? That's why the field, I think, concept is really useful here, because it's already relative and already transformed, as you already said it. So it's this dynamical continuum of self-organization, which formalized by enactivism and specifically by Varela and Maturana. But I also wanted to bring in another concept that is less talked about within this literature, which I find really underrated. It's this notion that has been developed by Donna Haraway in the Cyborg Manifest, and her notion of, in the book Staying with Trouble, and the notion of sympoiesis. And I think that's so underrated. The sympoiesis is, instead of autopoiesis, sympoiesis is making with, making together, right? And I quite like that notion, or that concept, that allows us to then go, as one would go, from cell to cognition. But then as we arrive to more societal or social practices, then the sympoiesis might here be really helpful to think about ways in which one could conceptualize it in terms of like crowd cognition, for example, right? Or the ways in which we might have social groups, social organizations, where we have what we would call social cognition. What was for me so frustrating, at least back in the day, and maybe still a little bit, that the interactions, right, are not, they are not formalized as much, so as often as interactions that are making with, right? That's what I find, that this sympoiesis is a concept that is quite rather useful. Autopoiesis, it's extremely useful as well. One of the components that I find most useful in there is the one that is developed by looking at how a cell, right, is both situated and both distinct. And I think that's kind of like what you make, were going at, and I really like that idea, which is from a more biology or neurobiology perspective, that it is operationally closed, but thermodynamically thermodynamically open, right? So, and then because of that almost contradiction, right, one arrives at this way of looking at a cell and at cognition, or as an individual in a larger organizational group, right, as they formalize it as a precariousness. And I love that concept. Right. So the status of a cell is one of precariousness. And what that means is that it needs to remain thermodynamically open, but operationally closed at the same time. And it's beautiful, right?
Yeah, and it's that balance, so, constantly oscillating between these sort of like a structure and movement, and then you're kind of at this macro micro level of always kind of sensing, feeling, relating, and then observing how we are constantly evolving internally, but also with others. And I was in a thing the other day with these women who work in really complex spaces, domestic violence, sexual abuse, frontline workers, and we were talking about how do you sustain yourself. And one of them said, the most constant thing is change. And we're always changing, and she talked about a range of different practices that she had to sustain herself. But it was this need to kind of, it was a beautiful living example of that in practice. This working, we have cells, but we act as cells and organisms ourselves in these clusters, in these different contexts. Every context has its own kind of structure, if you like, but it's always moving, evolving, and changing. And it's holding those dynamics at play. I feel like we've been quite philosophical. I know we're sort of coming to the end. I love all this stuff, but I want to kind of come to some sort of practical stuff as well. In terms of how do we take this stuff out into the world, live it and feel it. And this goes back to this notion of affect, I think, the living, feeling, the stuff that doesn't have words, that we don't have all the concepts. Most of us are not living in a conceptual world. We're moment to moment enacting, and as felt beings. And those felt beings, those felt spaces are shared felt spaces, so they're collective spaces at the same time. So like practical stuff, and we're thinking about the world and its support, the way that it's structured around us that shapes us and guides us and suggests what we ought to do. How do we resist that? And also, what are those practices that can help us to hold that balance?
Yeah, so that's the tricky one, and I think that the example that you gave, a very real world one, is quite fundamental. I tend to go against the armchair philosophy because of that, right? Because I find it very disconnected to the real world, and then in the end, there's a massive question mark on the usefulness of it all, of a very withdrawn from the real world. It's all very nice, very good to sit on the armchair and think, oh, but what it is like to be alive, right? But at the end of the day, what have we done, and what difference has it made for anyone, really? And in many instances, it's not even productive because it is operating with assumptions of a world that is not. It's operating under the assumption that the world is not what it is, right? That it is not already a place at which we arrive that already has power dynamics embedded in it. The affordances that we talked about and the continuum negotiation between facticity and agency that Simone de Beauvoir talks about in Ethics of Ambiguity is precisely that. It's that when we arrive to a room, there is already power dynamics in place that has nothing to do with anything that we might have done in our life. There's no merit whatsoever about anything that we might have done. It's just the way in which the world is already worlding, right? So that's why I find it armchair philosophy so not useful and in many instances harmful. So I think that to counteract that, we need to start the inquiry from observing what the world is, right? And then from that perspective and having not an assumption of what an ideal world would be like, but what the world is, then thinking about the ways in which the things that we do matter for that particular world that exists. So the point being in this, that when we are thinking about spaces, those spaces should be able to be adaptable and individualized to cater to the differences, right? And here we can start thinking about so many things that we are not doing. Like in education, the ways in which education is standardized, right? So if we have a child that is rocking his chair, right? And then the teacher might say, well, stop rocking the chair. And then the child might come back and say, but that's how I think. Now I'm going to not be able to think anymore, right? And then we arrive to educational rooms and settings in which are absolutely not apt to that divergence, that neurodivergence, but also that cognitive creativity. It doesn't have to be a neurodivergence. It can be just literally for prompting the cognitive creativity. And then as we arrive to the neurodivergence and mental health, for example, the ways in which we are not yet working with the environment as an affordance for a therapeutical intervention, right? So we tend to fix the person, right? We tend to fix the person. The person is wrong or broken. This is the vocabulary that we use, and we don't seem to have so many problems with that. And the idea here is that there are many different ways in which we can work with the environment and create an environment that is much more prone to a more individualized experience of the environment. So this goes to the commentary we're making about the ways in which I would like to have birds, I would like to have, right? So I think that this is very much a component that we are not approaching so well, and it might go from education to mental health. I've got a bit of work on how to use precisely complex systems theory to individualize a treatment to a specific, for example, a specific child. Let's say some child with autism, for example, in which case but this is across the board for everybody, particularly on mental health, in which cases textures, sounds, lights, the design matters so much, and it's so not done, in which it could be designed for children's rooms, their own room, right? Lights, textures, colors, all of that matters immensely. And that would be an excellent component to have for mental health, to think how design can be used as a component for mental health, but not only that, for education, for healthcare. There's this hospital in Melbourne that was designed by an architect that is a great friend of mine, and is the Royal Children's Hospital. I don't know if anybody is acquainted with that hospital, but it won a couple of prizes, and it's really, really good, because what they tried to do there was they wanted to have open wings. And the whole community was like, the whole doctors, etc., communities, they're like, no, we can't have that. We need to have our offices, right? And what they wanted to do was they wanted everybody to work together without hierarchies. And the concept there was that they wanted people to go and hang out. The hospital would have to feel like anyone would want to go and hang out there, because that matters for recovery. So that's what they did. They had a massive battle, because now doctors had to be like sharing the wings with like all of the other staff, right? So they have like these open floors and open wings, and it's beautiful, the concept. And they were able to pull it off. And that's what they worked with. They worked with the idea that we need to build an environment that is healthy, not unhealthy, right? That people would want to hang out there. That was at least the challenge that they brought on themselves, and I think it worked beautifully. So I think that if we start thinking from the problems that we have and take them seriously into the way, so it's reverse, right? It's reverse engineering. It's the ways in which the environment itself is what has some causal components for health, for development, for creativity. So we go back to the Beauvoir for constraining, right, or for freeing, right? So I think that that'll be wonderful.
So yeah, so that's a beautiful way for us to kind of pull all these threads together. I mean, we've covered a lot of different ground, and I think balance and integration and this kind of oscillation between what we might think of as the external world and the internal world, and how we engage with it. That piece. And when you're speaking there, I did actually think of like Florence Nightingale, who was a radical mover and shaker in her time, and the idea of opening a window was radical. So we can do it, and we have done it, and then things can become formularized and entrenched, and we can keep on checking in and recalibrating. And I think that goes back to the idea of agency and movement, and that the thermodynamic and movement and the cell, keep things moving, and this oscillation between structure and dynamic systems that are connected. Yeah. Thank you, Inês.
Oh, thank you
so much. Yeah, we could go on forever, I think.
Yeah.